Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gorge Waterway Action Society's first online webinar out of our online webinar series. So as you all know, today we're going to highlight connected watersheds. So we're going to go into some of the basics, the links, and the threats to not only BC waterways, but watersheds and waterways around the globe. So this presentation has been produced and will be presented by myself and my colleague, Jamie. Okay, so to begin, we're going to go through some of the rich Indigenous history of the land. So we want to recognize the vast groups of First Nations people that have been on these territories before European settlement. So the Esquimalt Gorge Park, we also call it EGP, that's how we might refer to it today, has had a vastly changing and diverse history through time. So the park is part of the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. So the Songhees, Esquimalt, Tsuut'ina, Wasanich, and other First Nations groups, historical and cultural relationships with the land continue to this day. So prior to European settlement, Indigenous peoples used Gorge Waterway for fishing, hunting, and travel. So it was a very prominent area for them in their day-to-day life. Gorge Waterway was referred to as Camosac. So today, the Songhees First Nations represent these important relationships as the original stewards of the land. And there are some links up here to find out more about the Songhees First Nations today and the important work that they do. I urge you to check out some of these links. They are also in your info pack, so you can always refer to those as well at a later time. Okay, so going off of some more recent history, Esquimalt Gorge Park is a 1.5 kilometer stream. Esquimalt Gorge Creek in Esquimalt Gorge Park is a 1.5 kilometer stream that drains a massive 217 hectare watershed into Gorge Waterway. So with the arrival of European settlers, the area went under several different names. So it was used as early as the 1860s for recreation purposes. It then transitioned into the name Kinsman Park until 2006, until it received its namesake today that we know it by, Esquimalt Gorge Park. So throughout these decades of use, the park has seen heavy industrial, recreational, and other forms of human activity. So it became apparent throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s that these decades of human impact had caused a significant impact on EGP and the surrounding ecosystem. So throughout processes such as use of a tidal swimming pool, diving facilities, amusement park, tennis courts, bathhouses and estates, this environmental degradation had occurred, and it became clear to government, to organizations, and to citizens that some action needed to be done in order to restore the park to its former ecological heritage. So today, the Gorge Creek Restoration Project that daylighted in the 2000s has restored 2 hectares of stream and riparian habitat. So it's pretty impressive. This entire system of wetlands, streams, and ponds filters about a third of Esquimalt's water. So this is really important idea or quality to know about the waterway as it affects our water quality pretty concretely. So who is Gorge Waterway Action Society and what do we do? So as I mentioned, Gorge Waterway Action Society, as well as our partner Gorge Waterway Initiative, daylighted in the early 2000s when it became clear that some work was needed to promote the restoration of Esquimalt Gorge Park. So Gorge Waterway Action Society, I may also refer to it as GWAS throughout this presentation, a little bit easier to say, so just keep in mind that means the same thing. We're a nonprofit organization and we work through all ages education, restoration, and stewardship. So the primary hub of our organization in EGP is the Nature House, which I'm in right now. So the Nature House during pre-COVID times was a hub for, like I said, all of these activities and community involvement. So the Gorge Waterway Action Society wants to contribute to the health of EGP as well as the community that surrounds it through community events, cleanups, restoration, and volunteer and youth involvement. So Obviously, we all know what has been happening this last year in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it has proved to be very different from past years for our organization. However, we have maintained a really steadfast dedication to education and stewardship. So we've adapted our reach through online programs, and even this very program that Jamie and myself are part of, the Youth Community Partnership Program. With its valued partners, with our valued partners, such as the World Fisheries Trust, Gorge Waterway Initiative, and municipal groups, GWAS has retained a really holistic and determined commitment to the health of the park and the community. So below, we're going to discuss why the health of watersheds, such as ones that surround us in EGP and around the CRD, we're going to discuss why they're so incredibly important to the environment, wildlife, and humans. So where I am right now in the Nature House, where Esquimalt Gorge Park is, especially important to those of you that might be joining us that are not locals. So Esquimalt Gorge Park is located north of the Inner Harbor from downtown Victoria, and Gorge Waterway extends all the way to Portage Inlet. So essentially we are west of the city center. So those of you that may be a little bit familiar with Victoria, or those of you that live around here may have visited this area before, but this is a map of where we're located, and this is a panoramic view showing the Gorge Waterway in front of us here, and then the Nature House right up above my head here. And Gorge Creek and Esquimalt Gorge Park provide some really important examples into the watershed process, so we will go into kind of some very specific details about the park itself. And just to provide a fun little video, this is a video of one of our filtration fens in the park. So as you can see, lots of waterfowl in the area, and it's also a great fish habitat. So the area in this fen is not very deep. It's only about 1 foot deep, but it does provide some really important water quality actions, which we're gonna kind of go into later throughout the video. The most important thing that we want to remember about watersheds is they are very complex. Another really interesting fact that we learned is that everyone on Earth lives in a watershed, no matter where you are. So you may have heard them called drainage basins or catchments before. They're synonymous terms. They mean the same thing. Basically, what a watershed is it's a system. It's a physical concept for a system that operates all around the world. So essentially, a watershed is made up of different components. So this is land, rivers, lakes, ponds, reservoirs, aquifers, which are really deep groundwater sources, snowpacks, glaciers, wetlands, even rainwater. So the entire system of a watershed drains 2 types of water into a common source. So these common sources can be streams, lakes, ocean, or rivers. So these 2 types of water include surface water, we call that runoff, or groundwater, that's called base flow. So watersheds exist, like I said, all over the world, everywhere in the world, and they are categorized into 2 big groups. So a watershed can be natural or it can be urban. So it's a pretty big concept, and it might be hard to visualize all the watersheds happening around the world. But depending on categorization, a watershed can be small or it can be very large. So we're going to take this time to do a community poll. So as I mentioned, watersheds can be very large or they can be very small. So how many major federally recognized watersheds do you think that Canada has? So actually, there are 5 major watersheds that the government has recognized in Canada. So these include the Atlantic Ocean, Hudson's Bay, Arctic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and the Gulf of Mexico watersheds. But like I said, it's easy to generalize watersheds into these big groups. But depending on how large of an area you're looking at, you can go into smaller groups, and there can be smaller watersheds within these larger ones. So some can include thousands of miles and thousands of creeks and rivers that are working together. If you want to discover what watershed you are in, this is sort of only for the locals here in Victoria. The CRD has offered a really great link, and that's in your info pack. But you can actually check which watershed you live in within the Capital Regional District. So if you all wanted to do that after the webinar, it's a really great tool that you can find. Okay. So this is again a picture of our park. This is this is the stream running through just near that fen that we showed you, just right before that fen area. So this is a picture of the riparian zone. So that's the area between an aquatic and terrestrial habitat. So we wanted to highlight this specific area just to sort of introduce some of the ways that watersheds work. So Gorge Creek, it operates in a very complicated but very efficient filtration process. So through 2 ponds, several stream reaches, fens, tidal marsh, and an estuary, the Gorge Creek actually is able to filter and clean that water coming out of Esquimalt, as I mentioned earlier. So EGP contributes to our water quality and our watersheds in an incredible way, and it provides lots of habitat for fish and waterfowl. So pictured here, like I said, is that creek. We're going to discuss it a little bit more in depth later, but channel structure is really important for watersheds and waterways. So our biology stream is actually working hard to get baseline data into some of the water levels here, and they're going to help Esquimalt in getting closer to the potential for salmon habitat here in the Gorge Creek. So this includes channel work, such as possibly adding dendritic channels, and increasing habitat for small forage fish that salmon like to eat. So the process of altering channels is very complex, and it is very individual to each system that you're looking at. So a couple of factors need to be looked at, but that is one of the goals that they're looking at for Gorge Creek. Okay, so in order to know the full importance of watersheds, we need to go into those distinctions that I mentioned. So those natural versus those urban watersheds. So watersheds sound great in theory, but how exactly do they relate to us or other wildlife? So watersheds in their nature, they involve the work of several components. So this includes land topography, so how your land, what the substrate and the surface of your land is, elevation, how high up you are, organic matter like tree debris and fungi like mushrooms, and different water systems that we mentioned above like rivers and lakes. So a natural watershed is found within something like a mature forest. So this forest might have meadows and other different systems that are working together to process the water coming into it. In a natural watershed, the surface is very porous. That means it's very leaky. So water can easily soak up and be contained within all of this organic matter like tree debris. And when this water eventually reaches other sources, when the groundwater or the surface water reaches larger water bodies, it tends to be very clean. So it's a really, really good example of how a well-functioning watershed can actually clean water. And urban watersheds. Unfortunately, they act in a very different manner, and they are often quite a bit more inefficient. So in a city, for example, there are lots of what we call impervious surfaces. So roads, pavement, parking lots. These surfaces cannot contain that extra water like a natural watershed can. So a lot of this water tends to just simply wash away. So this is important because in 30 to 70% of urban watersheds, rain hits the ground and washes into the storm drains. This contributes to river flooding, however, some water does still go to groundwater or aquifers. So obviously, extra runoff. In a city, we call it urban runoff or stormwater, even if it doesn't pertain to a storm. This is important because contamination also becomes a concern in cities. So when our cities are functioning, unfortunately, we do release pollution and contaminants. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but things like pollutants from septic systems, pesticides, animal and plant waste, heavy metals. Water can pick all of these contaminants up, and they can lead them to larger water sources, such as our rivers and our lakes. The third point why urban watersheds can cause problems is the more runoff you have, unfortunately, the more erosion you have, which also contributes to river flooding, and it can sort of decrease the stability of our banks and our soils. Okay. So now we're ready to fully appreciate the importance of watersheds now that we've gone through those two types. Watersheds keep life healthy. So some of you may have heard about something called ecosystem services. And if you haven't, that's okay. We're going to go through them. They're a very straightforward set of benefits that we receive from a healthy ecosystem. So these can include things like clean drinking water and improved water quality, a reduced risk of flooding, fuel for energy, such as hydroelectric facilities, habitat for fish and wildlife, which can relate to our recreation or subsistence, control of invasive species, which can be very costly, provide transportation, recreation, and enjoyment. So all around, a healthy watershed is good for everyone, including wildlife. It's important to remember that rivers and streams and watersheds connect to each other. So nutrients are delivered and connections are made. There's no one isolated system. This is important because watersheds, as the topic of this seminar, are connected. And atmosphere, streams, lakes, human activity, and the movement of wildlife can all help to link these systems together. So we mentioned it very briefly when discussing urban watersheds, but how exactly do our industries, our cities, our vehicles, and our households impact watersheds? It's important to remember the concept of a connected system. So nothing is isolated. Whatever happens on land or in our waterways is eventually going to find their way often to our watershed systems. It's a common notion that once we throw something out or put it down the drain, it's out of sight, out of mind. Unfortunately, in this case, that does not occur. So all of those pollutants and those contaminants that are flowing into our watersheds, unfortunately, often find their way back to us or to the wildlife around us. So some of this water that contains those pollutants flows to sewage, some to runoff, and some actually goes back into the atmosphere. But harmful substances that are not disposed of properly can eventually find their way into these systems. So this is a really good graphic from the CRD. There is a link on your info packets that has a large full version of this, but basically the idea behind this graphic is you can see how our boats, our buildings, our homes, our gardens all have an impact into watershed health. Later on, we will go into some best practices to keep watersheds healthy, but it's just a really great example of the connectedness of these systems. And we're going to go into some results that can happen when watersheds might be polluted or not functioning to their proper abilities. Okay. All right, so to look at a local example, we've chosen Fraser River Chinook salmon. So this was a 2018 study looking into how physical structure of a habitat might either help us or might affect a species such as these salmon here. So remember when we talked about the channel structure in Gorge waterway, how we were trying to increase habitat for forage fish and salmon? This is almost a larger scale example of that. So freshwater habitat complexity for things such as salmon is really important. So how much structure you have in the habitat, things like organic matter, different types of surfaces and substrates like sand or silt. This can all make a difference in the habitat that these animals need. Unfortunately for the Chinook salmon who travel throughout the Fraser River system, there have been some changes to their habitat complexity. So a lot of the meandering channels have actually straightened. So this decreases the complexity of their habitat and it causes problems for them as it's not a successful habitat, not as a successful habitat for them. Chinook salmon is really important for a variety of reasons. They're a prey item for some top predators such as grizzly bears and killer whales. They're really important for recreational anglers, as well as an important cultural staple to many First Nations communities. So they're unfortunately on the endangered species list right now. They're threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So these researchers found that there is a very strong connection between this habitat complexity and these the success of these salmon. Fortunately, some of the restoration efforts that were made to improve the structure of their habitats were found to be successful. So this is really great news. This is good evidence that physical components of watersheds remain really important for the survival of several species. Okay, so physical improvement of habitat is super important, but let's not forget the importance of water flows and water quality. So watersheds don't care about our human borders. They will override these borders, and they will flow however the ecosystem directs them, regardless of what municipality or what country they might be in. So this is another great graphic from the CRD. This is a water flow diagram. So it's of a local system here, Craigflower Creek watershed. So you can actually access more of these water flow diagrams via this link. There's also the link on your info packet. So I'm not going to go into this too much in detail, but essentially we can see that a large portion of water ends up in Craigflower Creek. That's right here. And it can affect actually the entire Portage Inlet, which is a huge expanse of water. For those of you that live here in Victoria, you'll know how far north Thetis Lake is from downtown Victoria. Thetis Lake is also involved in this water system. So really, really set of complex factors that are all affecting how water and contaminants can move through a watershed. And how water flows through a watershed can depend on several factors: how much rain there is, and other precipitation, the land cover, the slope of the land. So every watershed is different, but it's important to know that water can flow very efficiently through different systems. So heading back to the topic of contamination and water flow, we've already discussed how important physical features can be in a watershed, but we also have to remember what happens when water quality can go wrong. So there are two very similar results that can happen when water quality becomes compromised by pollution or contaminants. And they're very similar. It's easy to mix them up, but they're called bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So when contaminants enter our watersheds from air or land, they can cause some pretty severe effects. It might be easy to think that pollutants get swept away into large water systems like an ocean, but unfortunately, many of these organic compounds can be attracted to organic compounds in living beings. So sometimes natural watersheds can deal with pollution, but when you have an urban watershed, there's not as much ability for that filtration and water storage. So all these contaminants can move pretty quickly throughout. So basically, the essential differences between bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation essentially refers to the changes in a single organism's life. So throughout an organism's life, it will or it can accumulate more and more pollutants as it gets older and as its tissues get larger. So if we look at these small fish, we can see that they're healthy fish. They have no contamination. But as they may interact with more environments or consume prey that does have these contaminants, it is going to build up those contaminants in their systems until they're a very large fish that is laden with pollution. Biomagnification focuses more on the connectedness between different species. So if we look at these small krill or plankton, whatever they may be, they do have a small amount of contamination within them, but the prey that is feeding on, or the predator that is feeding on these fish, the more and more krill that they eat, the more and more contamination they're going to pick up, and vice versa. So eventually leading towards this bear, we can see that the bear has a lot of contamination within its tissues because it's feeding on the seal, which feeds on many fish, and the fish which feed on many of the contaminant heavy krill. So it sort of acts as a chain reaction. And this is important in watersheds because it creates an extra conservation concern for large or long-lived species, for example, like a bear or a whale. So these contaminant loads build up to the next level, and soon enough, these top predators are consuming really toxic materials, even just through their food. Okay, so we're going to look at an example of bioaccumulation in a large watershed on the east coast of North America. This is Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the US. There's a high frequency and historical evidence of industrial, agricultural, and other urban land use. And there has been found a lot of mercury and harmful compounds called polychlorinated biphenyls. Essentially, the important thing to remember here is that mercury can come from natural sources, but most often it can come from human sources, such as from industry. So when mercury enters these ecosystems, it unfortunately does very well in aquatic systems, and it can transfer to the tissues of living organisms like fish very, very easily and stay in their tissues for a very long time. So this is a good example of how the contaminants can travel from a single item into us, because if we consume those fish that are laden with that mercury, we eventually receive those contaminants back. Continuing on the same topic, I'm going to use a little bit more of a local example. So this is another local salmon species, but this time sockeye, and we're going to look at water quality instead of the habitat structure that we looked at. So Fraser River sockeye salmon use some of the most polluted and industrialized waterways in BC. Some of the most common pollutants that we find in BC include heavy metals. So all of these fish encountering within their environment and any pollutants that they come into contact with, things like pesticides, agricultural chemicals, there's more of a list here that you can look through. These contaminants were actually found to disrupt the migrations of sockeye salmon. So as some of us know, salmon rear and spawn in freshwater systems like rivers, and then they return to the ocean as adults. So when these migrations are disrupted, it not only these contaminants not only affect the health of the fish, but it also affects their ability to reproduce. So the ability of contaminants to affect fish is important, but if our problem stopped there, it would be a lot more simple. Unfortunately, looking at bioaccumulation and biomagnification working together, these issues don't stop just at lower level prey items. So they can continue into larger predators. Some of you may be familiar with killer whales here in the Salish Sea. There are two main ecotypes that we tend to see, one that feeds on marine mammals and one that feeds on Chinook salmon. So both Chinook salmon and marine mammals can carry high contaminant loads because, again, they're really, really close to that top level of the ecosystem. So when killer whales consume these food items, contaminants can build up in their blubber and their fat reserves, and it can cause a lot of health problems for them. It can even be passed to infants through nursing. So it's a good example of how contaminants can be passed through way up to the top of the food chain into species that many of us love and are very important culturally, as well as to the ecosystem. Okay, so it's time for another poll. It's clear through these examples that watersheds can definitely affect our oceans, but can our oceans turn around and go and affect our watershed health? So I'm going to give you guys a couple minutes. It's just a yes or no question, so I can think about that for a little bit. Great. So yes, you guys are correct. Oceans can turn around and they can affect watersheds, vice versa. So there's a study that looked at grizzly bears, and grizzly bears are common in coastal North American watersheds. And some of them feed on salmon that migrate up to those freshwater systems, but some do not eat these salmon. So the scientists were able to figure out there were higher levels of POPs, persistent organic pollutants, in these grizzly bears that ate the fish in comparison to those that did not. So grizzlies face a multitude of conservation concerns, but this posed an extra concern, and it also showed us how salmon can act as a delivery service of pollution between the ocean, accumulating pollutants in the ocean, bringing them back into the watersheds. And let's remember that salmon can also interact with pollution in the watersheds themselves. So it's sort of a multifaceted issue for the fish and for top predators. Okay, so how you can help our watersheds. I'm not going to go through all of this in just super descriptive detail. This information is available through that info pack as well, but the CRD has come up with some really great techniques that households can utilize to prevent contaminants in water systems. So avoid power washing. That's one of the big ones. Power washing can actually dislodge paint and other chemicals from surfaces. So try to avoid it if you can. If you can avoid it, clean the surface before. Use oil pads for absorbency in oil-rich areas. Paints, as in our poll said, they shouldn't enter waterways. They shouldn't go down the drain or end up on the ground. Follow the instructions on the label to dispose of them. Take them to a recycling depot. Know how to deal with a spill. Pools and spas. So chemicals in these systems can harm wildlife. It's best to talk to your municipality about how to deal with this wastewater. In such a beautiful temperate area like Victoria, I know there are many gardeners out there, but there are some actions we can take in our own gardens that really have a huge impact on the health of our watersheds. So when you're gardening, when you are using pesticides, try and use earth-friendly options, earth-friendly compost and pesticides. Don't pour excess onto the ground or into the drain. And also planting techniques. So using companion planting, putting plants that contribute to the health of each other beside each other, native ecosystems, those tend to fare better and prevent, the havoc of invasive species. Use garden rotations, so you're limiting the strain on the soil, and encourage pollinators. Use organic compost. So all pretty straightforward things. In such a rainy environment as ours, we can also collect water using spouts from rain. So this, again, decreases the strain on our watersheds. When we're building, remember the topic of impervious surfaces. We want to try and use surfaces that are going to soak up as much water as they can, things like grass or gravel. Okay, so it's important to go through these individual actions, but it's important also to think of the bigger picture. So our industries will always continue to industrify, our facilities will run, our materials will be produced. So what are some bigger actions we can take to really work to protect the lasting health of our watersheds? So a couple of things you can do. Obviously, COVID-19 willing, you can help out with beach or shoreline cleanups, join restoration work when it's safe again, remove invasives from your own household, report spills, maintain your vehicles, boats, and connect with dedicated organizations. So organizations such as Gorge Waterway Initiative, ourselves, and World Fisheries Trust, we can tackle larger issues that we may not be able to tackle as individuals. So this very YCP program has provided a wealth of restoration and study into the park, and produced opportunities such as this webinar that you're in right now. By supporting these organizations on the ground, we can amplify our impact. You can also support nonprofits through word of mouth, social media engagement, volunteer work, and other time or monetary donations. As citizens, we can include petitions and letters to government leaders, make our voices heard through voting and municipal decisions, and think critically about the businesses we choose. So before you leave today, I don't expect you to remember everything that we said today, but some of the major takeaways we want you to carry with you. Watersheds are very important systems. They deliver runoff and groundwater to larger sources, such as our rivers, lakes, and oceans. In urban watersheds, water laden with pollutants can find its way into our waterways and our wildlife and even ourselves. We all live in a watershed. Watersheds are all connected and they can be organized very specifically or very generally. What happens on land affects our watersheds and eventually our ecosystems. Okay, so me, Jamie, and Gwaz, we want to thank you all for participating. Jamie and myself want to thank our supervisors who have provided us ample support with this webinar and our learning through this program. We hope you stay in touch with more upcoming programs. We will be back again at future dates with more webinars. Our next webinar will be pollinator meadows and the importance of these really critical ecosystems. If you have any feedback, questions, advice for future webinars, feel free to reach out with us. Here's our website as well as our email. You can also connect with us on Facebook. Thank you so much. I'm going to give a few minutes for questions. If anyone has to go at this time, you're welcome to. But if anyone wants to have a bit of a discussion, we'll be here.